The day was fading into twilight as I decided to pay a visit to my grandmother's gravesite on my way home from work. The last vestiges of the day were slowly surrendering to the encroaching night, painting the sky in hues of deepening purples and blues. The day's hustle and bustle were gradually giving way to the serene hush of the evening, a perfect time for a quiet, reflective visit. It had been 5 years since my grandmother's departure from this world, yet the memories of her warm embrace and comforting presence were still as fresh as the morning dew. Her stories, her laughter, her wisdom, everything about her was etched deep within my heart, her legacy living on within me. As I approached the cemetery, an eerie stillness blanketed the area, the moon casting elongated shadows among the headstones. The rustling leaves whispered tales of the departed, their essence lingering in the air. The cemetery, a place where the living come to remember the dead, was a stark contrast to the vibrant life I had just left behind. The gravesite was bathed in an ethereal glow, beckoning me forward. Standing before her final resting place, a chill ran down my spine, as if my grandmother's spirit was acknowledging my presence. The cold stone of the headstone, bearing her name, was a stark reminder of the mortal coil we all must inevitably shed. In the dim light, I noticed a figure slowly navigating through the headstones. It was tattered, almost spectral, moving with an odd, disjointed rhythm. Despite the initial shock, I felt an inexplicable pull towards this figure, its familiarity tugging at the strings of my memory. My curiosity got the better of me, and I called out. The figure halted and turned toward me, revealing an elderly and frail woman who strangely resembled my grandmother. The sight was both chilling and fascinating, a mystery unfolding right before my eyes. What was happening here? Who was this woman? Only time would tell. A mix of disbelief and awe gripped me as I cautiously approached. The figure before me, a spectral silhouette in the dimly lit cemetery, bore an unmistakable resemblance to my grandmother. Her familiar features were etched in an ethereal glow, a ghostly echo of the woman I had known and loved. The very sight of her invoked memories of a past life, a time filled with laughter, wisdom, and warm hugs. She stood there. Her spectral form was an unsettling beauty, a paradox of sorts. She was a ghost, yet she was so much more. She was a memory, a longing, a part of my soul that refused to fade. She was my grandmother, the woman who had once been my rock, my guiding star in the darkest of nights. Her presence, even in this spectral form, held a comforting familiarity, yet there was something amiss, something that seemed out of place in this ghostly reunion. Her eyes, once warm and welcoming, now held an eerie, distant look. The soft smile that had once graced her face was replaced by a hardened line of determination. Her hands, once tender and loving, were tightly clenched, as if holding on to a secret too heavy to bear. Her spectral form began to shimmer, like a candle flickering in the wind, the light dancing in her eyes. And then, without warning, a change so abrupt it felt like a cold gust of wind on a quiet summer night. Her demeanor shifted. The eerie calm that had surrounded her seemed to shatter, replaced by a storm of emotions too complex to decipher. As I drew closer, a gut-wrenching roar pierced the stillness, a primal sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. It was a sound that sent chills down my spine, a sound that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And just like that, my grandmother's demeanor shifted. No longer was she the comforting figure from my past. She was a ghost, a spectral entity shrouded in mystery and fear. She sprinted towards me with an unnatural speed, then abruptly bypassed me, heading directly to her gravesite. In the blink of an eye, the ghost of my grandmother was at her own tombstone, her spectral hands clawing at the earth with a fervor that was almost animalistic. She was desperate, frantic, as if the very soil she was unearthing held the answers to questions long since buried. I watched in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight was surreal, a stark reminder of the thin line that separates the living from the dead. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, was now a stage for an eerie spectacle that defied all logic. Summoning my courage, I stepped forward, my voice barely a whisper in the chilling night air. "Grandmother!" I called out. "What are you doing?" But my words seemed to dissipate like smoke, lost in the cold wind that swept through the cemetery. Her focus remained unbroken, her ghostly fingers continuing to claw through the earth. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched her spectral shoulder. But instead of the familiar warmth I had known in life, I was met with an icy chill that sent shivers down my spine. In an instant, her grip tightened around my wrist, her strength belying her ethereal form. With a force that took me by surprise, she cast me aside, my body hitting the ground with a thud. Unfazed by my presence, she continued her desperate search, her digging growing more frantic with each passing moment. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. She stood up, her ethereal form shimmering in the moonlight. A low murmur escaped her lips, her words barely audible. "They are coming." Without warning, she crawled on all fours into the surrounding woods, her spectral form disappearing into the shadows. And just like that, the cemetery was silent once again, the echoes of her haunting words the only reminder of the spectral encounter I had just experienced. Confused and shaken, I gathered myself and followed, the dense foliage of the woods enveloping me in darkness. This was a new territory of fear, a dark labyrinth where every rustle of leaves resonated with an ominous echo. The ghost of my grandmother had moved with such a speed that keeping up with her spectral pace was no easy task. The woods, as foreboding as they were, thrived with an eerie life of their own. The gnarled trees seemed to whisper tales of the unknown, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands against the moonlit sky. My heart pounded in sync with the rhythm of the forest, each beat echoing the words she had left me with. "They are coming." In the midst of this haunting symphony, I fought my way through the underbrush, the brambles pulling at my clothes like desperate hands. Each step was a blind gamble, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath my feet. It was a relentless pursuit, a race against an unseen clock. Suddenly, the dense foliage gave way to a clearing, an open space bathed in silver moonlight, untouched by the forest's oppressive darkness. It was as if I had stepped into an otherworldly realm, a place where time seemed to stand still. Yet the ghost of my grandmother was nowhere to be found. Once again, I was alone. The silence in the clearing was deafening. Each breath I took sounded like a thunderclap. I stood there, my eyes straining in the darkness, searching for any sign of my spectral guide. But all I was met with was the vast emptiness of the clearing, a silent witness to my fear and confusion. And then it began. A distant sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself, a low, ominous rumble. It started as a whisper, gradually growing into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. As I stood alone in the ominous silence, a distant sound began to reverberate through the night, a low, ominous rumble. The echoes of my grandmother's words now took on a terrifying significance. The woods, the clearing, the rumble, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I was yet to comprehend. The air grew thick with an unsettling energy, and an inexplicable fear gripped me. The echoes of my grandmother's haunting words seemed to reverberate throughout the dense woods, and I felt a shiver of dread course through me. They are coming! But who were they? And why was her spectral form so desperate, so filled with terror? I found myself standing in the heart of the woods, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy of leaves overhead. The silence was oppressive, the darkness seemingly alive with unseen threats. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the rhythm of my growing fear. I thought back to the graveyard, to the frail apparition of my grandmother. The desperation in her ethereal eyes, her frantic digging at her gravesite, her cryptic warning. I couldn't shake off the feeling that her actions were a harbinger of something ominous. But what? Was she trying to warn me? Was there a threat lurking in the shadows that only she could sense? Or was her ghost trapped in a perpetual state of fear and distress, a reflection of her final moments in the mortal realm? The possibilities were as endless as they were terrifying. I wished I could reach out to her, to understand, to help, but the more I dwelled on it, the more my fear morphed into a chilling realization. I was out of my depth, lost in the unknown, facing a mystery that was beyond my comprehension. The eerie silence of the night was shattered by the distant rumble once again. It was closer this time, more distinct. A cold wave of terror washed over me. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. With a heavy heart, I turned my back on the woods and began the long walk back. Each step took me further away from the gravesite, from the ghost of my grandmother, from the enigmatic warning that left me with a lingering sense of unease. Haunted by the cryptic encounter, I left the cemetery with more questions than answers. The memory of that fateful night lingered, leaving me to wonder about the thin veil between the living and the unknown, and the unsettling revelation that even in death, some secrets refuse to rest in peace.